Welcome to Working with JavaScript Modules. And in this module, we're going to kind of start from the beginning, and we're going to talk about what a module is and how you start to use them. Now, to get started, I had mentioned that we are going to wrap the entire conversation in a real-world environment. So we're going to take a minute or two to set up our demo environment. We're going to download some code from GitHub, and we're going to get some things up and running. And we'll start to look at the problem set and why we need modules. And once we get through that, we'll talk about what modules are and what the syntax is a little bit and why you use them and how you go about getting those created. And then we're going to talk about some things to think about because modules work a little bit differently than many other things in JavaScript. So we just want to talk briefly about a couple of things to keep in mind as we go and build out the rest of the course. So the first thing to do, let's go get our demo environment set up. Before we get going on modules, let's take a minute to set the scene here. We're going to run this course in the context of the Global Mantics User Conference. Now, this is a website that we have inherited, and honestly, the code's a little gross. So over the course of this course, you're going to clean it up and break some of this JavaScript out into modules for better maintainability. Now, I've gone ahead and set up the starting point in GitHub, so let's take a minute and get that downloaded and installed. Let's go out to my GitHub repo, and I've set up a bit.ly link for you if you would like that. And you can click here to download or to clone the repo based upon your own personal preferences. This is really the only interaction with GitHub that I'm going to have, so I'm not going to dig in very much here. If you're not familiar with GitHub, just click download and drop it in a folder somewhere. Now, right now I have this set up to run in a very lightweight Node application, and you don't need to know anything about Node to go through the course. But if you don't have Node installed, it's a very simple process out here on nodejs.org. Just download the LTS version, and you should be good to go. Once you've got the code downloaded and Node installed, open the code directory up in your favorite IDE. Now, for this course, I'm going to run everything in VS Code. You're free to use any IDE you want, but VS Code is emerging as the default standard for web development, so that's what I'm going to use. Once you have the code downloaded and opened in your IDE, we're going to run two commands to get this up and running. npm install, which will get Express and Morgan installed, and then we're going to run npm start to run the website on port 3000. So now let's open this up in Chrome, and there you see our Global Mantics website. If you scroll down, this section right here is the part we'll be playing with in this course. So let's look at the code behind this piece and start this process. Okay, now that we have this thing up and running, let's take a couple of minutes and look at how we would deal with this situation before modules and what problems modules are actually trying to solve. So if you come out to this Global Mantics website that we have up and running, and we go to the code back behind it, let's go into public and then index.html. Now in here, if we scroll way down towards the bottom where our JavaScript is, you're going to see, let's slide this over, you're going to see a lot of code. So we've got sessions template that has a whole template for returning a session. You've got this render function. You've got our data items right there. All of this code is sitting in this index.html, and its sole purpose is to populate these items right here. And that data is coming out of this sessions.json file. If we look in there, you'll see those three items. Okay. Now, we know for sure we don't want all of this code sitting in our index.html. And so typically what we would do is we'd come in here into JavaScript, our JS folder, create a new file, and call it app.js. Then we come back over to index, and we'd scroll up to this script tag right here, to our get sessions, scroll all the way down to the get sessions. We'll cut that, clean it up just a little bit. This chunk of code right here is for the hamburger menu, and we don't want to mess with that. So we'll just leave that there. We'll save that. And then in app.js, we'll drop all that code in. Save it, come back over to index.html, and we add a script tag. Script source app.js. Let's add the JS in front of it. Now, if we save that and go back over to our window, we refresh, and notice it still works. Now, just in case, we go to inspect, just to make sure it's working right. And now if we look down here, there's our script app.js. And if we go to sources in JS, you see now we have our app.js. So that worked. But it still has a problem because everything's available still at the top level. And we can see that if we come back over here and we scroll down to this script tag here, if I just say console.log data.listItems, which is where we're storing all of that session information when we get it back from our sessions.json file, we still have access to this data object, even though it's not in index.html. Check this out. Keep my console open. I'll refresh my page. And look, I have this empty array. And the reason it's empty is because it gets loaded here in a minute. So actually, if we just wrap this in a set timeout, and just wait a second before I run that console.log, and I refresh, now you'll see, look, there's all my stuff. So that's not a really good idea. I don't want to expose all of my JavaScript up to the parent level. So it's not good enough just to pull everything out into a separate JavaScript file. So what we would do then is we'd come into our app.js and we'd wrap this in what we call an IIFE. And now an IIFE is an immediately invoked function expression. And what it looks like is that. And so we say, this is a function. We take all of our code, and we drop it inside. And now what's going to happen is when app.js gets called, it's going to run this code, and it's not going to share anything outside of its scope. So if I save that, come back over here and refresh, now you see it still worked, but notice it blew up because data is not defined. So that's good. We're protecting things from the global scope, and we're hiding things from index.html. So index.html is all nice and clean, but you have this weird, funky, iffy grossness. And it's not really easy to surface things back up to the global scope that we can share back with index.html. And we want a way to clean that up and make that nice. And that's where modules come in. And that's where modules will make our lives a lot easier. And so what we're going to do over the course of the rest of this course is we're going to talk about how modules are going to give us the ability to take this code and partition it out somewhere and share pieces of it back and forth across either other modules or back up into our index and make our code a lot cleaner and easier to follow. Luckily for us, we no longer have to rely on weird syntax or kludgy workarounds to build clean standalone bundles of code. ES6 has introduced a mechanism that allows us to build modules natively in JavaScript. Now we do that with two new keywords, import and export. Export is the keyword we use to create the module, and then import is going to be the keyword we use to consume that module. So here's a hint, that's going to be module 3 and module 4 respectively of this course. Now the import and export keywords allow us to encapsulate our code into a single protected entity. Basically, that means we get to create this little bundle of code that we can package up and then only expose pieces out to help guide understanding about what this chunk of code can do and utilize that chunk of code in a meaningful way. Now then that allows us to control access to the code as well. We saw in that last clip, just putting code in a script file doesn't prevent you from accessing individual members of that code. And we don't really want to allow that. And modules are going to allow us to protect our code so that people who are consuming our code can't necessarily go in and make changes to what's going on. And last but not least, we can reference our own dependencies internally. Now, what that means is that if a piece of code needs to reference a Lodash function or something similar to that, I don't have to import that globally into the whole application. I can just use it in my one module to keep scope to a minimum. Now, before we dive into what this looks like in practice, let's take a quick look about some of the considerations you need to think about as we go through and work through modules, because some of these are pretty different than what you might expect or what you're used to. First, modules are singletons, and what that means is when you export something from a module, every other thing that imports that module gets the same instance of it. And now that can be super helpful out of the gate, but can cause some oddities if you don't expect it. Just keep that in mind. You're using the same thing everywhere that you import a module. Now, along those lines, the individual items exported are not just values, but they're pointers or bindings to the properties. Now, we'll dig a little bit more into that a little bit later, but just know that if something is exported and then changed, it changes everywhere. Also, once you define what's being exposed through an export, you can't change it later at runtime. Once it's loaded, it stays how it is. And that can be a little weird in JavaScript, where you can normally change anything at runtime. Like nothing is static in JavaScript, well, except that the things you're exporting out of a module, those are static. We also have one module per file. Modules are file-based. And if you're loading multiple modules into your browser, you're going to request those files one at a time over HTTP. And let's talk about that for just a second, because that could be a little disconcerting. Now, when we get to HTTP 2, that'll make things a little bit more palatable, because that's going to hold up in a socket connection and you load multiple files and that'll be fine. But in the meantime, when we get through modules, normally what we're going to do is use a module bundler like Webpack or something like that to consolidate them all down into one file. Now, we're not going to cover specifically the use of Webpack or something like that in this course. This is just to get us an understanding of what modules are and how to use them. And then depending on your implementation, you may pick a module bundler that's going to work for you. All right, so we have just gotten started in this course working with modules in JavaScript. And so far, we've only done a couple of things, but we set up our demo environment. So if you don't have your demo environment working, that's going to be important if you're going to follow through for the rest of this course. So take just a minute, go back to that second clip, and get your demo environment up and running. Secondly, we talked about what modules are and just a little bit of the 4 basic characteristics of things that make up what a module is and why they're going to be beneficial to us moving forward. And lastly, we talked about just a couple of things that are a little bit different in modules. So as you're using modules and as we go through the rest of this course, there's just a few things that are a little weird potentially about modules that you want to make sure you're paying attention to as we go through the rest of this course and just as you use modules in your day job. All right, now that we're there, we should have a demo environment up. We understand what modules are. Let's take the rest of this course to actually go in and start writing modules and then consuming them in modules 3 and 4.